A teenager who dreams of the sky gets a chance to join a secret pilot program. What should have been the most inspiring day of his life suddenly turns into a personal challenge. His presence in the wrong place unleashes a storm of prejudice and an unexpected challenge. But when the truth comes out, the consequences are louder than anyone in the building could have imagined. In the room that should have been home to the noise of teenage life, with rapper posters, gamepads on the floor, and rain-spattered windows, there was a disciplined silence. The walls were covered with maps of global air routes, black and white photographs of World War II pilots, and posters of Boeing, Airbus, and Lockheed. On the table lay thick aviation reference books, a simulator control column, and on the shelf, like icons, stood 1:100 scale airplane models. Jalen Ward was not an ordinary teenager. From the age of 6, he knew the sky was calling him. He didn't just dream of flying. He knew the technical parameters of the machines, remembered the engines by their sound, and could distinguish an A350 from a Dreamliner by the way they climbed. When other kids were reading comics, he was reading pilot memoirs. But Jalen never let himself think it would be easy. He was a black guy in an industry where people like him were still considered the exception. Even though his father, Malcolm Ward, was one of the East Coast's leading investors, and his mother, Vivian Ward, was the CEO of airline giant Solair, he was determined. No favoritism. He dreamed not on his parents' shoulders, but on his own wings. When Solair opened the selection process for its prestigious SkyPath Future Aviators program, Jalen didn't say a word to his mother. He spent weeks honing every line of his essay. He wrote with a sparkle in his eyes, describing the first time he felt the wind under his wing, sitting in the cockpit of an old Cessna with his mentor at an airfield outside of town. He wrote about his dream, not in rosy terms, but as a goal he was working toward every day. He didn't mention his last name. He didn't refer to his mother. He didn't attach any family photos. And when he received the letter that he had been accepted, he did not jump for joy. He only smiled, deeply, like a man who knows that victory is deserved. He remembered that day down to the last detail. At exactly 8 o'clock, he stood in the Solair terminal, wearing a light gray bomber jacket, a white t-shirt, and jeans. His badge, Jalen Ward, SkyPath, hung on his chest like a badge of honor. He was here. He had made it. He was accompanied by Lisa Marcus, the HR director, a confident woman in her 40s with a light sense of humor and friendly energy. "You're amazing," she said as they walked through corridors lined with glass partitions and uniformed pilots. "Honestly, I rarely meet guys who talk so passionately about takeoff thrust. My mother always said, if you want to be the best, understand what each screw is made of," he replied with a smile. "It's clear that you listened to your mother." First there was the control tower. He looked down at the runway, at the headlights flickering on the gray asphalt, at the small figures of the ground crew. He listened to the pilot's conversations with the tower like music. Then the maintenance hangar. He ran his hand over the body of a brand new Boeing 787-10. The metal was cold, smooth, as if alive. He knew every line of this plane from the drawings, but now he was standing next to it in reality. He even looked into the cockpit. He sat on the edge of the co-pilot's seat. His fingers touched the control stick, his eyes slid over the displays. Not to press, just to look. But he felt, someday all this would become as familiar to him as the handle on the door. A little later, as they were heading to the pilot's rest area, Lisa stopped and looked at her phone screen. "Damn," she breathed. "I need to get back to the main office ASAP. It'll take 20 minutes tops." "Everything's fine," Jalen nodded. "Wait in the pilot's lounge. It's quiet there, and by the way, there's a great documentary on the history of jet airlines. You should check it out." He hesitated. "This is the crew area. You have a badge. You have permission. You are not breaking anything. I am responsible for you. Relax and enjoy." He walked inside hesitantly. The first few minutes were magical. The room was spacious, with soft chairs, black and white framed photographs of pilots, a coffee machine humming in the corner. Several pilots were discussing routes. Someone was laughing by the window. On the screen were archived footage of Concorde's first flight. A legend. He watched, holding his breath. One by one, the pilots left the lounge, heading off to flights. And now he was alone. With the documentary, with the smell of coffee, with a dream. He didn't notice a woman enter the room. Captain Gretchen Voigt. In her 50s, she had a straight posture, a perpetual frown, and a uniform pressed to a crispness. Her gold stripes ran across her shoulders. She had 2 decades of flying experience under her belt and was one of the few female captains in her age group. But she didn't see herself in this boy. Not a colleague of the future. Not a dream. She saw a threat. Teenage boy. Black. Alone in a lounge. Out of uniform. In a hoodie and sneakers. With a badge she didn't think belonged to him. Her eyes narrowed. And in that moment, without questions, without pause, without trust, she made a choice. A choice that would change the day. And open an old wound that she wanted so much to believe had already been healed. This is where it all just began. The pilot's office was quiet in a way that felt intelligent rather than empty. The sound of a documentary flowed softly from the screen, punctuated by the occasional clatter of a coffee machine and the rhythmic click of a clock on the wall. Jalen sat on the couch, leaning forward slightly. His eyes, alert and alert, followed the footage of the development of jet aviation. He didn't even notice that he was alone in the room. He didn't notice how the uniformed men left the lounge one by one, some for a flight, some for the briefing room. He was completely absorbed in what was happening on the screen. Takeoffs, landings, disasters, feats. Everything he dreamed of, everything he aspired to. Until Captain Gretchen Voigt walked into the room. She stopped at the threshold. Sharp, stern, like a right angle. She had the look of someone who had fought for respect all her life and now demanded it silently, simply by her presence. But today there was more than just weariness in her eyes. There was suspicion. And deeper, something that cannot be put into words, a feeling that someone had violated her order. Her gaze immediately caught on Jalen's figure. Teenager. Black. Out of uniform. Alone. She took a few steps. The badge on his chest gleamed, Skypath Future Aviator. And that was enough to make her feel uneasy. Or, as she would later say, the instinct of a professional. Excuse me, her voice sounded sharp, clear. What are you doing here? Jalen turned around. He hadn't expected aggression. He hadn't expected suspicion. It had taken him a moment to realize the question was being asked in an accusatory tone. Miss Marcus, my supervisor, he began. She asked me to wait here for a moment. Who? Lisa Marcus. From Human Resources. Gretchen narrowed her eyes. And she just left you here? Alone? Yes. She said it was aloud. She extended her hand. Show me your badge. Jalen quickly lifted it on the tape, but before he could, her fingers had already pulled it out from under his collar. The plastic snapped and the fastening cracked. Hey, he said, standing up, but she was already holding the badge in front of her, studying it. Is this a fake? She said, almost not asking but asserting. What? No, of course not. I said, is it a fake? Or did you steal it? Something inside snapped. Until that moment, he thought that if you deserve it, you will be seen. Heard. Believe. This badge was given to me, he said, looking her straight in the eye. I passed the competition. I am a participant in the program. Programs? She asked ironically. And who decided that you were suitable for this? He felt heat rise from his neck to his cheeks. Not from shame. From injustice. I myself. With my work. With my essay. I didn't ask anyone. Gretchen slowly turned the badge over as if she were holding evidence in her hands. More and more often I see people like you getting into places where they shouldn't. Excuse me? He asked again, but his voice was already trembling with anger. Don't pretend you don't understand. One gets a break and now, apparently, thinks he can sit here where the real pilots are relaxing. I didn't. He swallowed. I didn't break any rules. I'm just sitting here waiting. I see. With a badge that raises questions. With an I'm the boss here look. She pressed the button on the radio. Security, pilot's lounge. Immediately. Suspicious teenager, false clearance. Potential security breach. The words hit the air like glass on stone. No. Please. No need. Just, he took a step towards her and then froze. Call Lisa. She will confirm. But she didn't hear. She didn't want to hear. And he realized she had already made her decision. There is no doubt in the eyes, no desire to understand. Only confidence in one's own rightness. It was at that moment that Jalen felt that thing he had read about before. The feeling of the entire world shrinking down to a single glance. A glance that says, you don't belong. You're suspicious. You're unwanted. He took a step back, instinctively raising his hands. His palms were shaking. He looked around, but no one came in, no one heard. A minute later, two people entered the room, Officer Grayson, a heavy-set man with a heavy gait, and a young assistant with a radio. There he is, Gretchen said, pointing. Unaccompanied. Unauthorized. Name? Grayson asked. Jalen Ward. I'm a member of Skypath. Grayson snorted. Documents? I have my student ID in my backpack, I can. No need, he interrupted. How did you get here? They showed me in. The escort went out for a couple of minutes. And you decided that you can walk around here? I didn't, his voice trembled treacherously. I was just sitting. I didn't touch anything. Grayson looked at his partner, then at Gretchen. We must accompany him. You can't just, Jalen began, but Gretchen interrupted. We can. This is not a place for show. He felt his legs turning weak. He didn't know what to do. Argue? Run? No. He knew. There was one thing left. He pulled out his phone. His fingers were shaking. He scrolled through the list and tapped on a contact. Mom? Mom? I need you to come. Right now. Terminal B, Pilot's Lounge. There's a situation. There was a short pause on the other end. I'll be there in 5 minutes. He put the phone away. His eyes were burning. Gretchen chuckled. Amazing. Mom's going to fly in and start telling me how her poor boy is being bullied? I hope she has a cleaning lady's uniform? He didn't answer. He just looked. For the first time, not at the sky. At the floor. But deep down he knew, now there would be a takeoff. Just not his. But those who decided that they could remain unpunished. The silence in the lounge was icy. Not the kind that gives respite, but the kind that precedes a storm. Jalen stood between two guards, each of them looking at him as if he were a problem to be fixed, not understood. Captain Voight watched silently, clutching his badge to her chest as if it were evidence incriminating him in some grave crime. He felt his heart beating so hard in his chest that it seemed to drown out the sound of footsteps, conversations, even the voices in the headphones of the employees passing by behind the glass. Everything in him was compressed into one impulse, to run. But he knew that he couldn't. Not one extra step. Not one sudden movement. Not the slightest chance of being misunderstood. I want to call my mother, he finally exhaled, surprised at how reserved his words sounded. How touching, Captain Voight chuckled, crossing her arms over her chest. And who is she? Does she work in the cafe on the 3rd floor? Or maybe she cleans here at night? He didn't answer. He just took out his phone. His fingers were shaking like a man trying to piece himself back together. He scrolled through his contacts and found one that had just one word written on it. Mom. Mom. I need you to come. Now. Terminal B. Pilot's Lounge. There's... His voice wavered, but he forced himself to finish. There's a situation. A second of pause on the other end. And the answer, dry and confident as always, I'll be there in 5 minutes. He put the phone down, put it back in his pocket, and just stood there. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because he knew there was nothing else to do. She will do everything. A minute and a half later, a voice hissed over the radio of one of the guards. All available personnel at Terminal B level. Clear the way. Repeat, VIP en route. Clear the route immediately. The guard's eyes widened. Gretchen narrowed her eyes. What is it? She asked warily. They didn't have time to answer. Change rushed through the glass doors into the lounge. First it was the rhythm, quick, confident steps in heels. Then a figure. A woman in a sharp, dark gray suit. Her hair perfectly coiffed. Her face focused, like someone used to riding storms. Vivian Ward, CEO of Solaire. A woman whose name was spoken with cautious respect in the airline industry. Behind her are 3 employees in black suits. One is the company's lawyer, the second is the head of security, and the third is Lisa Marcus, the same woman Voight deemed an optional witness. And the whole room froze. The pilots rose. The waiters stopped with trays. Even the passengers outside the lounge began to slow down, feeling the air in the terminal change. Vivian walked up to her son. She put her hand on his shoulder. He barely breathed, looking at her. But there was no fear in her gaze. Only rage, cold, focused like a laser. This is my son, she said, looking Captain Voight straight in the eye. Do you want to explain to me why you called security on a child who was here with official permission, with a company badge, and under my personal patronage? Voight opened her mouth as if she wanted to answer, but no words came. You are his mother? She whispered at last. Yes. And if you had even asked his name, you would have known it. Instead of acting as a self-appointed judge, Lisa stepped forward. I only left Jalen here for 20 minutes. I confirm. The badge is valid. The route was agreed upon. Everything was according to protocol. Vivian's eyes darted to the guard. And you? Did you check the documents? Did you listen? Or did you immediately decide that since the uniform is missing, but the skin color is present, then you can act? Officer Grayson swallowed, looking down. It was a misunderstanding, madam. Oh no, she interrupted. It was a pattern, and it won't work anymore. She turned to Voight. Captain, surrender your badge immediately. You are temporarily suspended from duty, pending investigation. This is absurd, she cried. I acted in accordance with. According to what? Vivian interrupted, taking a step closer. According to suspicion? According to personal animosity? According to skin color? Voight fell silent. The lawyer took out a document. There are already 3 complaints in your file. Now the 4th, this time with direct evidence. Vivian turned to her son, a softness appearing in her face. Is everything okay, baby? He nodded, slowly. Now yes. Another woman came up next to her, in a pilot's uniform, dark skin, for gold stripes on her shoulders. Jalen, she said quietly. I'm Captain Tamara Johnson. I heard what happened. And I sat on this couch once, too. Only no one intervened then. Today they did. Because you're not alone. He looked at her, and something inside him, something that had been frozen with fear, began to melt. Do you want to see the cockpit on a real plane? Without security, without humiliation, just like a future pilot? He nodded, and there was more power in that nod than in any shout. They walked together, through open doors, under the gaze of those who saw but did not stop. And every step Jalen took sounded like a rebuke to prejudice. They walked down the long hallway of the terminal, and for the first time all day, Jalen felt a weight lift from him. Captain Tamara Johnson strode confidently beside him, tall and slender, with a straight back and those same 4 gold stripes on her shoulders that he had seen in photographs of his heroes for so many years. There was no hesitation in her stride. She moved with the quiet dignity that comes not only from experience but from an inner strength forged through years of struggle. It seemed as if the very air parted before her. I've heard about you, she said without turning around. Her voice was even, almost a whisper, but there was a hardness to it like metal. You're the guy who got through the sky path without anyone's help. Yes, ma'am, Jalen said. His fingers were still shaking, but he was starting to feel grounded inside. I wrote the essay. I made the cut. Well done, she nodded. It was the same for me. Only then there were no programs, no essays, no chances. Just closed doors and clenched teeth. They passed a glass partition behind which the aircraft parking lot was visible. One of the Solaire aircraft was preparing to take off, its fairing gleaming under the spotlights, the equipment moving around like an ant colony, harmoniously and silently. Do you know what an instructor once told me in my first year at the flight academy? Tamara asked, stopping at the panoramic window. Jalen shook his head. She looked at me, not knowing who I was, and said, with that skin tone, the most you can do is serve food on board. He shuddered. Tamara smiled sadly. And 4 years later, I was flying my first commercial flight on a Boeing 787 for the same airline where she taught. Do you think she came up and apologized? No, ma'am. And you think correctly. But it was not necessary. Because I knew I belonged to heaven. She turned to him, her eyes attentive and calm. Today you were baptized. The first of many. Jalen sighed heavily. I just don't understand. Why was it so difficult for her to just ask? Because you messed up her world. In this world, you weren't supposed to be there. Not supposed to be smart, stubborn, confident, with a badge, in a lounge, alone. You're a living refutation of her rules. And that scares her. But I didn't do anything. You shouldn't have. You shouldn't. Look, Jalen, she leaned her hand on the railing. Your very presence is a challenge. Your confidence is a threat. Your silence is a protest. Not because you want to fight, but because you exist. He stared silently at the plane outside the window. It was hard for him to accept that someone could look at him and see not a teenager who aspired to be a pilot but simply a threat. Do you know what you should do next? She asked. Don't give up? No. Fly. Not just endure. Not just fight. But fly. Because you are needed. Because there are still few like you. And there are too many who still doubt you. She sighed. I'll take you to the cabin. I'll show you how it should be. Without suspicion. Without guards. Like a real student. He nodded. When they boarded, the empty cabin greeted them with subdued lighting. Everything was clean, neat, perfectly arranged for passengers who had not yet arrived. The cockpit was slightly open. Tamara waved her hand. Come in. He stepped inside and immediately inhaled a distinctive smell, a mixture of electricity, plastic, fabric, and metallic heat. A panel spread out before him, monitors, indicators, control knobs. He knew that most of them were currently inactive. But that didn't matter. He sat down in the right chair. Carefully, as if afraid to ruin the moment. This is the co-pilot's seat, she said, sitting down on the left. But in the future, it might be yours. He didn't answer. He just ran his hand over the panel. All those hours he spent in the simulators, all the moments when he dreamed of being here, came alive in his head. Do you want to try setting up a route? Is it really possible? Sure. I'll turn on the simulation mode. Don't worry, the plane won't take off. Bye. They worked together. She showed him commands, and he remembered them with incredible ease. It seemed like he had done all this before, somewhere in another life. Or in the same one, only inside a dream. Minutes passed. And then, finally, she leaned back in her chair. Not bad. Very good indeed. Thank you, ma'am. She looked at him with a slight smile. Don't call me ma'am if you want to be a pilot. Call me captain. He laughed. For the first time that day, he laughed sincerely. Okay, captain. It was already dusk when they stepped out of the cabin. The terminal was bathed in orange light. But Jalen walked straight. Not slouched. Not looking away. He went through humiliation. He went through fear. But he remained himself. Now he knew he didn't just dream of flying. He was already doing it. The cockpit was empty, but the feeling of flight was still there. He could still feel the texture of the controls under his fingers, smell the aircraft plastic and the instrument panels, hear Captain Johnson's voice in his ears, confident, calm, the way a voice in the sky should sound. He couldn't stop smiling. It was a tired smile, quiet, but inside it was huge. There were weeks of preparation, years of dreaming, and one devastating moment when it all seemed like it could disappear. But he's still here, among the planes, among those who fly. Captain Johnson left him at the entrance to the terminal, waving goodbye. See you later, future pilot. Of course, Captain. And these words were not just an answer, they were a promise. He returned to the waiting area where his mother was waiting for him. Vivian was standing with her arms crossed, talking to someone on the phone. But as soon as she saw her son, she immediately stopped talking and walked over to him. Is everything okay? She asked. Yes. Even more than okay. She looked at him carefully. Not the way a mother looks at her child, but more like a pilot looks at another plane, assessing where the damage was, what the pressure was in the fuselage, how it was climbing. I'm proud of you, she said quietly. Very. He nodded. Those were all the words he needed. But one thought was still pulsing inside. It was spinning like a screw, not letting go. Mom, he suddenly said as they walked towards the exit, you knew this could happen. What exactly? That I wouldn't be taken seriously. That just, my presence would be enough to scare someone. She didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. Yes. I knew. I've been through it myself. Do you think when I walked into the Solaire office, they looked at me and saw an executive? No. They saw a woman. A black woman. Aggressive. Emotional. Too confident. Too smart. Too out of place. They stopped at a display case selling miniature airplane models. Jalen instinctively picked up a replica of the Airbus A350. What did you do? She continued. No yelling. No proof. No attempt to please. Just working so that each of them would understand one day I am not an accident. I am a necessity. He put the model back in place. And I'll still feel like I have to justify myself. Every time I walk into the lounge. Or sit in the booth. You know what your strength is? She leaned closer. It's that you'll still walk in. And you'll still sit. Even if no one offers. Even if they silently judge. Because you're needed. Even if they don't understand it yet. They walked out of the terminal. The sunset was slowly turning the sky a warm peach. In the distance, the plane was starting to take off, its engines growling as if to confirm everything they had just said. The next day, Jalen came home. He didn't talk much. He didn't share. He just sat down at the table, opened his notebook, and started writing. He wasn't writing a complaint. Not a report. He was writing a letter to himself. A letter for the Jalen who might one day feel unwanted again. You don't have to prove that you're worthy of a dream. You don't have to be perfect to be respected. You have a right to be in these halls, in these chairs, in these booths. You are not an exception. You are the beginning of a new normal. He put the letter in the drawer. He knew that he might have to remind himself of this more than once. But now he had more than just the memory of an injustice. Now he had a cockpit, and a captain who had said, "You belong in heaven," and a mother who stood before the whole room like armor, and his own name written into the program where none of them could erase it. A week later, a letter arrived from Skypath. Dear Jalen Ward, you have been invited to the next stage of the program, a practical task in the Airbus simulator. Congratulations. Your result is among the best in the group. He didn't smile. He just straightened his back, and he took his old steering wheel out of the box under his bed. He plugged it back into the computer. He opened the simulator, and he started practicing. Slowly at first, then faster. Every movement is like a step towards the cabin. Every second is like a response to a phrase he no longer forgot. You are not here by accident. He knew that one day someone would try to tell him otherwise again. And he would be ready. Not because he knew how to defend himself, but because he knew how to fly. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video so you don't miss a new story.